almost 100, and that was back in 69, 1970, somewhere in there. And what's really interesting is she used to talk about what a life. She got to see the Orville brothers' first flight, and she got to see a man on the moon. Now that is a lot of change between here and there. And you know, we have to today talk about change, because the real issue today is willful change possible? And I'm talking about for the human family. There's the personal side, and we'll talk some about that, because there's all kinds of change theory about how a person can themselves change. And there's also the global thing. I mean, we've got technology gone crazy, climate change, viruses crossing all kinds of political borders, and conflict on the rise. So let's talk about this a little bit. And I'm going to, as usual, throw a lot at you up front. You know, change theory talks about in order to change intentionally, you have to change your image of your ideal self, and then compare your real self to that ideal self, and then develop a learning agenda in that gap, a plan, if you will. And then at the same time, start expressing these new behaviors in new ways, practicing them, trying them out. And then finally, to trust relationships that engender support of change. That's how a person changes, allegedly. And this model has been put in corporations and psychologists, and it's an important piece for us to understand. However, the change that is needed for the human family is immense. And the willful change we're talking about, that we're going to see is so complex, is so much greater than the whole concept of willful ignorance, which is very easy to come by. And we're not going to go into that too much, I pray. Now, the thing about it is the stage for change is being set. And I talked about technology and climate and viruses, but also today we're experiencing acute democratic stress. We're experiencing recurring economic instability, social fragmentation, pervasive cultural narrowing, where it's basically these narrow threads of culture fighting each other. There's this stealthy data imperialism. Man, study data and megadata, and wow, how it's used to manipulate and control. And then there's, of course, runaway technological disruption, robotics, synthetic biology, super intelligence, 3D printing. And it's an amazing thing. And now there's also ambient spiritual confusion. I love that one. Because we lack the shared axioms, rituals, norms that can shape purpose and meaning. Again, think about those cultural narrowing and the spiritual confusion. They go together. And then, of course, there's random terrorist threats, which they're all over the place. Change. You see, Einstein said it beautifully. He said, everything has changed but the way we think. Change. Now, I believe change is possible. We can change the way we think, the way we behave and perceive, and how we express ourselves. It's happening all the time. And if you look at the human family, it's going to change anyway. Did you know that the body temperature in my lifetime has changed from 98.6 to 97.9? Did you know in my lifetime that human bones are becoming lighter? And have you noticed that there's still genetic change happening all over the place with every birth that happens? You see, change is an inevitable thing. It's an inevitable thing. The cool thing is that as inevitable as change is, human beings are the most flexible and adaptable creatures that this planet has ever seen, even trying to adapt to the changes that we ourselves have initiated. Yet the pace of change is accelerating, a lot of change. So you see, it comes down to me that it's this false equivalency that the human family has set up. It's change versus staying the same. Now, staying the same is ridiculous because change it's happening. We're getting older. The world is changing. I'll be honest. Think of what it was like when many of us older people were young, and the phone rang. Someone in the house would scream, "I'll get it," and you'd hear feet running. Now everybody's wired in, man. And not only they're wired in, but the satellites are keeping track of every step you take, which is amazing. So you see, there's this delusion of false equivalency between the need and the want to stay the same and to change. Now, the problem with change is that we don't really know, if the change theory of the individual is correct, have an ideal version of yourself. Well, we don't have a metric for that. That's part of what our time is discerning. Those different qualities of narrowing and spiritual confusion and all of that, those are change happening. And we're looking for a metric of what is healthy, what is wholeness, and what is well-being. What really are those? How do we measure them, and how do we scheme those in our vision? Now, I'll be honest. My conclusion after this study is if we want to continue the good life and want it for everybody, change has got to happen. And it can't just be inevitable change. It has to be some kind of willful change. And yet everywhere I go, for the human family to exert willful change is not good news. So I've seen two ways that change happens in our world today. The first is conflict, and I laid out some places where that's happening. This is where the differences, I don't know how else to say it other than the stench of death motivates the change. It was Lincoln and Grant and Lee and Eisenhower and Patton and all these people, Marshall, the Marshall Plan, all these people were on a battlefield with the stench of death. They smelt it. They knew the suffering up close, and it motivated huge change, and it pushed us from empire builders to global builders. And we're still in that process. Now, the other way of change, which is my preferred way, is stories. I think change is going to come from stories. A larger context of meaning, a story that shows that nothing stays the same, and process and transformation are built right into the story so that they're no longer enemies, if you will, or points of discomfort, but they become part of the adventure and journey, the next reaching. So those stories are in my mind, the way we allow willful change to happen. And I will say, I used to watch a lot of Modern Family, and there's one called 15%. And the gay couple basically wants to know if the people around them can change to accept them. And they come up with the conclusion, about 15%. So 15% is not going to cut it on a global scale. There has to be some huge change. And will that change be forced on us, or will it be one that is part of our stories? So that's my opening. My name's Red Hawk. I'm here at the deep end. I'm in Spokane, Washington. Marianne Rudis is coming from Spokane Valley, Washington, and Bob Hayes is coming from Florida. One of those states that you have my prayers every day. Because talk about change. We've talked about reaction formation and the resistance to change. I've mentioned a little bit about willful ignorance. So these are forces that work against change. So I guess I want to know, and Marianne, I'll start with you. Willful change. One, is it possible? And two, how so?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And there's, on one hand, it seems like we can only know what we are shown. And so, do we have a hand in how we look at things, and do we have a hand in and changing? And I think that yes, but I think it comes from we make a choice in how we in saying that I'm open to change and I am willing to change. And when we make that choice, when we choose that, then we can kind of be taken down a path and open ourselves up to. I love that what you said about stories. We can open ourselves up to listen to stories. We can open ourselves up because, as you so well pointed out, change is going to happen. And it's either going to happen through pain and through sorrow and through all of these horrible things that are happening, or change can happen with us consciously getting involved. And we don't want it to be painful. We want to, and I really think that is the impetus, that we're not going to change unless we want to. And so I think that's, for me, like the big impetus for change.
Amen. And the point that you really laid out was is change going to happen to us or through us? And I think
perfect.
Yeah, that's a good distinction, and one that we better come out and play soon. Bob, what say you, bro?
Well, when you talk about willful change, it gets back to the big question that we've kicked around for many different episodes of, do we have free will? Do we, even if we say, well, I want to change, is that something that we consciously make that decision? Or is that just because we've experienced so many things that we suddenly come to the mindset that I want things to change? Well, it doesn't really matter one way or the other, because once we are conscious of something that can influence the way we act, then we are an agent of change. And that, I think, is where you get back to, I love it that you always come back to stories, because stories are how we experience the world, whether it's a play or a movie or a song or just interacting with other people. We experience that as some kind of message to ourselves. And again, I don't necessarily think this is happening on a conscious level. Maybe some of us are working to make it more conscious, but we are affected by the things that we see and hear. And once we start engaging, then it doesn't really matter why we're doing it, because we have started to move in a certain direction. Now, hopefully, as more people begin to move in the direction that follows the guideposts that we've talked about, our guiding rules of life, our guiding ways of interacting with each other, hopefully more people begin to see those as ways to motivate the direction that they want to push change. And then, of course, it gets back to the numbers game. And I've said this before, as a person who's trained in a lot of statistics, it all comes down to how many people are willing to make the change. Now, there can be one individual that sparks it.
Yeah.
And can then lead more. But the planet is not going to change and be guided by these signposts of proper human behavior.
Yeah. Well, and you bring something up, and there's really two kinds of change. There's the change that's happening around us, and how many of us in our lives have not said something's got to change here? It's that kind of thing. And then who was it that said when you get to the end of your rope, God is there? That's where change is happening. Jung often said as long as you're in your comfort zone, you're not going to grow. You know, you got to get outside that. So there's this change that's happening all the time. I mean, just take iPhones. It's not like someone said we're going to change, although I think Jobs had all kinds of images in his head when he came up with, you know, what he was thinking about and how these designers were thinking about the phone and who we are. Those changes are happening all the time. The technological and cultural changes, those are going all around us. The other is what you referred to, Bob, when we do get to the end of our rope. And I tried to lay out all the different ends of the rope we seem to be at as a planet, and that this is basically motivating us to say, we got to change. Something's got to change. Now, Marianne, you bring something up that I think brings us back to the spiritual piece, and that's that change is happening. We can be agents of change, like Bob, I love that word, agents, only insofar as we're on the rudder and we know how to tack the sails. The change is happening, and how we navigate through it and work with it is another measure of being in accord. And again, the changes that we need to make are predicated on our understanding of what is health and wholeness and well-being. And we're trying to come to those in some way. And Marianne, I think I might have cut you off. So.
Oh, no. Well, I was just going to say, you know, I love that, Bob, you brought up the idea of free will, because to me that starts me down. So when we think about change, are there things that are changeless as well? So are there things that will never change? Are we, you know, is there a part of our essence that is steadfast and will always be the same? And I kind of think there is, but I also think that we're thrown into the world to deal with all of these circumstances and all these things, and we can react from a place of fear and pain, or we can react from a place of love and story, you know, of how we want to see things to work out. And so I think that the whole idea that there is, that we do have agency, and where does that agency come from, and where does it lie, and how do we convince ourselves? Because sometimes we can feel like we're just victims, and especially if you have been a victim of some horrible things, if you were in the tower, right? If these things start to happen to us that we feel like we cannot control, what is it within us that we can control, that we can say, okay, we want a better world. We want it to look a different way. And so what is my part in that? And I think that's where that personal change comes in. And each one of us is responsible for what we're creating out in the greater world. And I think one of you guys said, you know, just becoming aware of that, the idea that we can make changes. We can help make the world look the way we want it to look.
And I might suggest that it's not fear and pain or love and story. It's fear and pain and love and story. As a matter of fact, the fear and pain can actually help create the story in such a way that it does inspire us to move in a new way. I don't know if y'all have watched the morning show. I'm halfway through it.
Integrate. Well, you have to integrate.
Yeah, and you know, I thought I understood sexual abuse in the workplace because of all the, you know, as a minister, every year you had to go to a thing on sexual misconduct. But I'll tell you what, they have laid it out in so many ways that are at cross purposes with itself, that shows the double binds, the subtle nuances. That story just brings up this little piece of human relationships that is abused in such a way that it can create, by participating in that pain, if you will, and the hypocrisies and all the contradictions, we can begin to see like something's got to change here. something's got to change in our corporate world. Something's got to change in our power relationships. Wait a minute, what is a power relationship? How does that work? It just, again, we got a half hour here to serve, to serve up the world's problems and solutions. And it's very complex. But I want us to see that, and I'm going back to the word you used, Bob, agents. We can become change agents. We can stand up. I have a secretary one time from Australia, and someone in one of her kids' classes was going on and on about immigrants and they're evil and bad. And the daughter, she said, I was trembling. I stood up and I could barely talk, but I had to say something. And I just said, I'm an immigrant. And the whole class changed. You see, an agent of change is a Martin Luther King, a Dr. King who dares to stand up and say, something's got to change. And right now, the human family is at the precipice of a whole series of something's got to change. And that's why we're talking about, can we effect this change? And I think we can, but it's a lot of everyday people touching the world in the name of this change in simple ways. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And each of us as individuals can take actions that are facilitating change in the way we want to see it. But again, I'm back and forth between optimism and pessimism. I heard a stand-up routine on Colbert's show the other day, and they were talking about all of these wildfires and floods and all of this kind of stuff, and it's all being recognized now as change. And he was talking about Al Gore, and he said, "Well, where was he 20 years ago?" And he goes, "Oh, that's right, 20."
Yeah. And
still, we're not taking action on this stuff. So how do we to listen and are not willing to change themselves? And that's where you get the
and I love it. You brought up examples like Dr. King of agents of change and people. And the first thing I thought of was those are people that speak a truth. And that's that changeless piece. So I believe that there are changeless truths. And that when we can have people that are brave enough to stand up and speak, though, have a ripple and affect change. And the example of that classroom with that little girl that just almost brought to my eyes, because that is something real that's happening, and people don't understand the effect of their words. They think sometimes when they spew some of these, no human lives involved here.
Well, and I think that
and when we can bring that.
Oh, we're breaking up here. Oh, I don't like this kind of technology. Wish I could just have you both here. And just as a point of interest, you can go to other podcasts. We have one on the free will. Is there free will, or is it just itty bitty billiard balls going based on forces that have affected them? I really think that it's important for us to see two things. One, the need for change, because it's all over, and that's individually and globally. And two, that we can, in some small way, have an effect if we are willing to pay attention. The Buddha's three imperatives were attention, attention, attention. To pay attention to these aspects of ourselves. I like the concept of having an ideal self and a real self, and there's a gap between the two. There's some work to do there. I got phobias to work on. I got neurosis to work on. I got all kinds of stuff to work on. You know, if any of us knew each other's family of origin stuff, we would all be more compassionate. Because families are funky. Change. Willful change.
Yeah, that's true.
Willful change. Is it possible?
Yeah.
Change. Is it going to happen? You know, and each of us have a rudder, and the change in this river that seems to be rushing more and more, faster and faster. So, I'm going to go for final comments. Bob, final comments?
Well, the fact is that change is happening, and we're in the middle of it. That's why I'm such a fan of Taoism and the whole idea of trying to become one with the change, trying to go with the flow of things. And how do we do that? Well, again, I come back to these guideposts that we talked about, the golden rule, and the idea that compassion is a high value that we should be cultivating and so forth. So, you know, we're in the midst of change. Action is change, inaction is change. No matter which way we go, we're going to have an effect one way or the other.
Oh, Bob's locking up on me. I even rebooted. All right.
So we may as well. That's it for me.
All right. Didn't catch that last part, Bob. You locked up on me.
Okay.
Be quick.
What I said was, you know, okay, whether we act or we don't act, we're affecting change one way or the other. So we may as well try and act in a good, positive way.
Amen. Mary Ann, final comments?
Well, I think the idea of willful change, you know, that first of all, recognizing that, yes, we can change. And just because things have always been a certain way, or we've been thinking a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't make things different. And we can't, and because things are different. And so how do we adapt to those changes? And that becomes from, we can change our behavior, but a lot of times when we just try to focus on our behavior, that doesn't last. We have to change the way we're thinking. And so when we start to change the way we think, the way we see things, how we integrate all of the things that are happening in the world and in our lives, then that's when change can become a much more pleasant experience than a painful one.
Amen. And you know, it gets down to living within our environmental means in terms of food and shelter and air and clean water and education and warmth, all of these things. But something has happened, you know, and Bob has talked about, you know, the golden rule as a guidepost, but it doesn't seem to hold. It doesn't seem to have a solid footing in the human soul. And it's there in every religion. So what are today's guideposts? How do we, you know, one of the things I opened the show with was, you know, we've lost the kind of universal axioms that held us together, the rituals that allowed us to. Is there some new religion, spiritual sensibility waiting to erupt? Has my life and the life of my co-hosts, have we lived our lives in this time of growing a new spiritual sensibility that is going to finally emerge? Someone's going to have a voice and be able to speak it? No, I don't think so. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be choirs of people speaking it. The new guideposts. What are they? How do we gather around the new maypole? What is the axis mundi, not of Judaism or Islam or Hinduism, but of the planet Earth? What is our dance? What is the Mayday that we dance around? We hope you'll join us. Until then, May the peace of the oneness of being be all over you, even in times of conflict.